So what is life like in different Italian cities and so forth? I mean, actually, it was pretty consistent all the way around Italy as far as that's concerned, because there was almost every place we had that had an actual city. Some of them were just bigger and had taller buildings. Their building is kind of interesting because they typically build in out of concrete, so they don't build really tall typically. If they ever got hit by an earthquake, it would be absolutely devastating, because they really didn't do much steel reinforcement until, I mean, most all the buildings were just concrete walls and block and that kind of stuff. But as far as the city themselves, certain areas were more kind of dirty than others. When you have that many people packed into that small of an area, I mean, Milan had 3.5 million people in an area that at that time was about the same, as far as actual square miles, as Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City probably had maybe 250,000 people at the time. So, I mean, it was, the population densities is just pretty staggering, actually. But as far as the culture and so forth, I mean, they have an interesting aspect of it when you're on your mission, and I don't know, I'm assuming it's probably still that way today. But they would have, they get up on an average day, they get up and have breakfast, they go to work for a couple of hours, and they have usually about one. They take a break, and they basically have it's kind of like in Mexico they would call it a siesta and so forth, but they would have this about 2-hour lunch break. And then most of the time they would actually go back home and have an hour and a half lunch, and then come back to work. And so about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd come back to work for a couple more hours, and then they would be done for the evening. Then the typical Italian family would be that then the father would come in, they would have dinner together, and then he would usually leave the mom to take care of the kids while he went down and went with his buddies and so forth and hung out down at the local pub or whatever with his friends. And that actually was pretty darn common at the time. Italy, I mean, it is the coolest historical place. I mean, like I mentioned about how I was in the city of Piacenza when they were celebrating the 2,500-year anniversary. There are castles. There are fountains. The parks are just absolutely breathtaking. I mean, we're talking outdoor fountains that have all these statues and so forth. I mean, there's the museums and so forth. The history there is absolutely amazing. Like I said, at the time, the United States, when I was there in 1983, and 82 and 83, the United States had not too many years before that had celebrated the 200-year anniversary of the establishment of the United States, and they were celebrating the 2,500 anniversary of this one town. It's so old, and people they weren't in a hurry. I think there's a perspective that they have from living in a place that has been continuously occupied for so many centuries. That, you know what? There's no big reason to be in a big hurry. And they just aren't. In fact, that's one of the problems that they've had, I think, with the the new Rome temple. It's been postponed and so forth, partially because of not following the guidelines of construction that the church demands, but also I think part of it's just they're Italians. They're not in a big hurry. They really don't feel a sense of urgency that we seem to have. In fact, they would kind of mock us Americans and say, Americans are always there in such a hurry and so forth. Yeah, just relax and enjoy life, and that's kind of the attitude that they have. Now, as far as how interesting, I mean, this is the seat of Catholicism, and so you have the Pope there in Rome, and you would think that and most Italians will identify with being Catholics. But what's interesting, or what I found is that in general, most of the time, their idea of being an active Catholic would be that they would go to Mass in Christmas time and again at Easter time. If they went to church twice a year, they were pretty much considered an active Catholic, and most of the Catholic people that we met really didn't have that much of an idea what their actual doctrines were. It was more of a tradition that they had, and so it was. They were quite receptive to the gospel message and so forth, but they also had this other interesting tradition, and that is that most of the time the grandparents or parents would essentially require or request that their children or grandchildren be they might be on their deathbed. They say, you know what? No, I just want you to promise me right now that you'll never leave the Catholic Church. And oh, okay, I promise. And so to be true to those promises, a lot of times people had a real difficulty with that. We had a lot of issues with the fact that the Catholic Church would not allow divorces at the time, and so forth. So people were separated. They couldn't be baptized because they couldn't obtain a divorce because the Catholic Church kind of, was a major part of their government, and so they wouldn't get divorces. They would just go ahead and just live their life and whatever. Even if they ended up getting in a relationship with somebody else, they still a lot of times would be married to somebody else because they just didn't want to go through the divorce process because it was difficult, almost impossible to get one. So that was another interesting thing.